The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the untouched breakfast plate. Margaret sat at the small wooden table, staring at her cold coffee. She'd been sitting there for almost an hour, lost in thought. This had become her routine over the past 6 months, waking up, making coffee, and then forgetting to drink it while her mind wandered to places she tried hard to avoid. The house felt too quiet. It had always been quiet, but now the silence was different. It pressed against her ears, heavy and suffocating. She glanced toward the living room, where the old piano sat against the wall. Its lid closed, a thin layer of dust gathering on the dark wood. She hadn't opened it since that last day. Couldn't bring herself to? Every time she walked past it, she felt a sharp pain in her chest and quickly looked away. Margaret was 67 years old, though most days she felt much older. Her daughter kept telling her she needed to get out more, to see people, to do something other than sit in this house surrounded by memories. But what was the point? For 43 years, she had been a music teacher. She'd spent countless hours at that piano, teaching young children how to find middle C, correcting finger positions, and watching their faces light up when they finally played a song without mistakes. Music had been her entire life, and then, for 3 long years, it had become something else. A lifeline. A way to reach someone who was slowly slipping away from her. David, her husband of 41 years, had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. She'd watched the man she loved gradually forget the small things first, where he put his keys, what day it was, what they'd eaten for breakfast. Then the bigger things started disappearing. Their anniversary date, their daughter's name, eventually, her face. But even when David couldn't remember who she was, even when he'd look at her with confused, frightened eyes like she was a stranger, there was one thing that still reached him: music. Margaret would play the piano. The same songs they'd listened to when they were young, the melodies that had filled their small apartment when they were newlyweds. And for those brief moments while the music played, she'd see a flicker of recognition in his eyes. His face would soften. Sometimes he'd even hum along, the words lost, but the tune somehow still. Buried deep in whatever part of his brain the disease hadn't taken yet, she'd played for him. Every single day during those 3 years, even toward the end, when he was bedridden and barely conscious. She'd sit beside him and play on a small keyboard she'd bought for the bedroom. The doctors said he probably couldn't hear her anymore, but she didn't care. She played anyway. The music was as much for her as it was for him, a way to say all the things he could no longer understand. When she spoke them out loud, he'd passed away in March, just as the first flowers were beginning to bloom in the garden he'd once loved to tend. Margaret had held his hand, hummed their song, and felt him slip away. The funeral was small. Their daughter had handled most of the arrangements while Margaret moved through those days in a fog. After everyone left, and the casseroles stopped coming, and the sympathy cards slowed to a trickle, she was alone with the silence. That's when she closed the piano lid and hadn't opened it since her daughter called every day. Worried. Margaret could hear it in her voice. That careful tone people use when they're trying not to push too hard but desperately want you to be okay. Last week, she'd called about some community event happening at the recreation center. Something about raising money for Alzheimer's research. Margaret had said no immediately. She wasn't ready to be around people, especially not people dealing with the same disease that had stolen her husband away, piece by piece. But her daughter was persistent. She'd called back the next day, and the day after that. "Mom, you can't stay locked in that house forever," she'd said. "It's just a few hours. We'll go together. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. Just come with me, please." Eventually, Margaret had agreed mostly to stop the daily phone calls. She told herself it was fine. She'd go, sit quietly in the back, maybe donate a few dollars to the cause, and then come home. It wasn't like anyone would notice her there anyway. She'd been retired for 5 years now. Most of her former students were grown with children of their own. She'd become invisible. It's just another elderly woman you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Now, on this cool October Saturday, she stood in front of her closet trying to decide what to wear. Everything looked dull and gray. She finally pulled out a simple navy cardigan and a pair of comfortable slacks. As she got dressed, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. When had she gotten so old? The woman staring back at her had deep lines around her eyes and mouth, gray hair pulled back in a loose bun, and a tiredness that seemed to go deeper than just lack of sleep. Her daughter picked her up at 1 o'clock. The drive to the recreation center took 15 minutes, filled with light conversation about the weather, about her daughter's job, about the neighbor's new dog. Safe topics that didn't require Margaret to talk about how she was really feeling. When they pulled into the parking lot, Margaret almost asked to turn around and go home. But her daughter was already opening her door, smiling encouragingly. Margaret didn't have the energy to argue. Inside, the recreation center was decorated with purple balloons and banners. Purple was the color for Alzheimer's awareness, her daughter explained. There were tables set up with information pamphlets, baked goods for sale, and a small stage at the front, where someone was adjusting a microphone. The room was already filling up with people, elderly couples walking arm in arm, middle-aged adults who had that exhausted look of caregivers, a few teenagers volunteering at the refreshment tables. Margaret and her daughter found seats in the back row. Someone handed her a paper cup of weak coffee, and she held it without drinking, her eyes scanning the room without really seeing anyone. The event coordinator, a woman in her 40s with a clipboard and an anxious expression, was rushing around making last-minute adjustments. There were speeches planned, a video presentation, and then musical entertainment while people mingled and donated. Margaret watched the clock on the wall. 1:30. She wondered how long she needed to stay before it would be polite to leave. Her daughter kept glancing at her with concern, and Margaret tried to arrange her face into something that looked less miserable. At 2 o'clock, the coordinator stepped up to the microphone to begin the program. She welcomed everyone, shared some statistics about Alzheimer's disease, and thanked them for coming. Then she introduced the first speaker, a man whose wife was currently in a memory care facility. Margaret tried to listen, but his words seemed to blur together. She'd lived this story. She didn't need to hear another version of it. The speeches continued. More statistics. More thank yous. Then the coordinator returned to the microphone with an apologetic smile. "We were supposed to have a pianist here to play some music for us this afternoon," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Unfortunately, she's called to say she can't make it. So if anyone here happens to play piano and wouldn't mind helping us out with a few simple songs, please let me know." The request hung in the air. Margaret felt her daughter's hand squeeze hers gently, but Margaret shook her head firmly, her jaw set. Absolutely not. She wasn't ready. She might never be ready. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and heavy, as the coordinator waited hopefully for someone to volunteer. No one did. And Margaret kept her eyes fixed on her coffee cup, willing herself to be invisible once again. The awkward silence in the recreation center stretched on. Margaret could feel it pressing down on everyone in the room. People were shifting in their chairs, some whispering to each other, others checking their phones. The coordinator stood at the microphone, her smile growing more strained with each passing second. She tried to laugh it off, saying something about how they'd just chat informally instead. But Margaret could see the disappointment written all over her face. Near the front, a group of teenage volunteers who had probably spent their entire Saturday setting up tables and hanging decorations looked crushed. They'd worked so hard, and now the event was falling flat. An elderly couple 2 rows ahead stood up and started gathering their coats. Then another couple did the same. Margaret watched as the room began to slowly empty. People mumbling polite excuses about other commitments and things they needed to do. She thought about David. Not the David from the last few years, but the David she'd first met at a college dance 50 years ago. He'd been so full of life, always joking, always seeing the bright side of everything. Even when things got hard, even during those dark years when the disease was taking him away, he'd had moments of clarity. In one of those moments, maybe 2 years ago, he'd looked at her while she was playing the piano and said something she'd never forgotten. His words had been slow and difficult but clear. "Don't stop playing," he'd said. "Music isn't yours to keep. It's yours to give." At the time, she'd thought he was confused, mixing up memories from when she used to teach. But now, sitting in this room, watching disappointed faces and feeling the weight of all this sadness, She wondered if maybe he'd meant something more. Maybe he'd somehow known that she'd want to lock herself away after he was gone, that she'd want to close the lid on that piano and never open it again. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were wrinkled now, marked with age spots, the knuckles slightly swollen from arthritis. But they were still her hands. The same hands that had taught hundreds of children how to play. The same hands that had comforted David during his worst moments. The same hands that had closed his eyes for the last time. Her daughter leaned close and whispered, "It's okay." But something in her daughter's voice told Margaret that maybe it wasn't okay. Maybe hiding from everything wasn't the answer. Maybe David had been right. More people were leaving now. The coordinator had given up on finding a pianist and was trying to reorganize the event on the spot, suggesting they move straight to the donation tables. But the energy in the room had died. What was supposed to be an uplifting afternoon of community support had turned into an uncomfortable gathering that everyone just wanted to escape from. Margaret felt her heart beating faster. Her palms were sweating. This was crazy. She hadn't played for anyone in 6 months. She hadn't even opened the piano at home. What if her fingers didn't work anymore? What if she forgot the notes? What if she broke down crying in front of all these strangers? But then she looked around the room again. Really looked this time. She saw the elderly man near the front whose hands were shaking as he helped his wife with her coat. She recognized that shake. She'd seen it in support group meetings during David's illness. It was the shake of exhaustion, of someone who'd been strong for so long they were running on empty. She saw a woman in her 40s sitting alone, staring at nothing, her face blank in that way Margaret knew too well. The face of someone going through the motions because actual feeling was too painful. These people had come here looking for something, not just to donate money or hear speeches. They'd come hoping to feel a little less alone in their grief, a little less crushed by the weight of watching someone they loved disappear. And now they were leaving, still carrying all that heaviness, maybe feeling even more isolated than before. Margaret's hands were shaking as she stood up. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment she thought she might sit back down. Her daughter grabbed her arm, concerned. "Mom?" she asked quietly. "Hey, I can play something," Margaret heard herself say, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, slightly louder. "I can play. Just something simple." Her daughter's eyes went wide. "Are you sure?" She whispered back, "You don't have to do this." But Margaret was already moving toward the front, her steps unsteady. The coordinator noticed her approaching, and the relief on her face was immediate. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, gripping Margaret's hand. "Even just a song or two would be wonderful. Whatever you're comfortable with." As Margaret walked toward the stage, she heard whispers rippling through the crowd. Some of the older people in the room seemed to recognize her. "Is that Mrs. Chen?" someone murmured. "The piano teacher?" another voice responded. "I thought she'd retired." "My daughter took lessons from her years ago," someone else said. Margaret reached the piano. An old upright that had probably been at the recreation center for decades. The bench was worn, the wood scratched and faded. She sat down slowly, every movement feeling deliberate and strange. Her hands hovered over the keys, not quite touching them. The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the people who'd been heading for the door had stopped to watch. She stared at the keys. 88 of them, black and white, the same as they'd always been. But they felt foreign somehow, like something from another life. Her fingers trembled as she lowered them onto the cool ivory. She pressed middle C, and the note rang out clear and true. Then she pulled her hands back, her heart racing. This was a mistake. She couldn't do this. She should apologize and walk away. But when she glanced up, she saw all those faces looking at her. Not with judgment or expectation, but with a kind of desperate hope. They needed this. Maybe not the music itself, but the feeling that something good could still happen. That beauty could still exist in the middle of all this pain. Margaret took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys again. She'd start with something easy, she told herself. Just a simple hymn. Amazing Grace, maybe, or What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Something everyone would recognize. Something she could play in her sleep. Her fingers found the opening notes of Be Thou My Vision. An old Irish hymn she'd played at countless church services and recitals over the years. The first few notes came out hesitant, uncertain. Her hands felt stiff, the muscle memory buried under months of disuse. She stumbled on the third measure, her left hand missing the bass note entirely. She winced at the mistake, but kept going. The hymn wasn't fancy. It didn't require any complicated technique or showy runs up and down the keyboard. But as she played, something started to shift inside her. Her fingers began to remember what they'd always known. The stiffness loosened. The notes came more easily. She finished the first verse and moved into the second, her hands finding their old confidence. The room remained silent except for the piano. Margaret kept her eyes on the keys, not ready to look up and see people's faces. She finished, "Be Thou My Vision," and without really planning to, transitioned into another piece. This one was different. Not a hymn or a simple tune, but something she'd played for David during those long afternoons when he'd been too tired to do anything but sit and listen. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. David had loved this piece. He'd asked for it over and over, even when he couldn't remember what it was called or who had written it. She'd played it for him the night before he died, her keyboard set up beside his hospital bed, her fingers moving over the keys while tears ran down her face. Now, as she played it again, those memories came flooding back. But they didn't overwhelm her the way she'd feared they would. Instead, they flowed through her fingers and into the music. Every note carried something grief, yes, but also love. So much love. For David, for the life they'd built together, for all the small moments that had made up their 41 years of marriage. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. But her hands never stopped moving. She played the Nocturne the way it was meant to be played, with all the emotion and tenderness Chopin had written into it. And somewhere in the middle of the piece, she realized she wasn't playing the simple tune they'd asked for anymore. She was playing for David, for herself, for everyone in this room who understood what it meant to love someone and lose them. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with a life of their own. She'd forgotten how this felt, how the music could take over and carry her somewhere beyond thought, beyond worry, beyond the careful control she'd been gripping so tightly for months. The Chopin Nocturne flowed from her hands like water, each phrase building on the last. The melody weaving through the bass notes in that way that always made her chest ache. She wasn't thinking about technique anymore. She wasn't worrying about hitting the right notes or keeping perfect time. All those years of teaching, of telling students to sit up straight and curve their fingers and count carefully, none of that mattered now. What mattered was the feeling pouring out of her, the grief and love and longing that had been locked up inside her. For so long with nowhere to go, the piano itself seemed to respond to her touch. Despite being old and probably out of tune, it sang under her hands. The recreation center's plain walls and fluorescent lights faded away. Margaret was somewhere else now, somewhere that existed only in the music. She was in her living room on a Sunday morning, David reading the newspaper while she practiced. She was in their tiny first apartment, playing on the battered upright they'd bought at a yard sale. She was at his bedside, playing that small keyboard, watching his face relax as the notes filled the room, as the Nocturne built toward its climax. Margaret's whole body moved with the music. Her shoulders swayed, her back curved over the keys, her foot pressed the sustain pedal with perfect timing. This was what she'd been born to do. Not just play the notes, but speak the language that words couldn't express. Music had always been her way of saying the things that were too big or too deep or too painful to put into sentences. She finished the Nocturne, the final notes hanging in the air for a long moment before fading away. And then without pausing, without thinking, her hands found a new melody. Debussy's Clair de Lune. She hadn't planned to play this. She hadn't planned to play anything beyond that one simple hymn. But now that she'd started, she couldn't seem to stop. The music was pulling her forward, piece after piece. Each one connected to a memory, to a feeling, to a moment in time she'd thought was lost forever. The Debussy was like moonlight made into sound, soft and shimmering and full of quiet beauty. Margaret played it with a gentleness that surprised even her. Her touch on the keys was light, almost delicate, coaxing out the subtle colors in the harmony. This piece had never been David's favorite, but she'd played it anyway. Late at night, sometimes when he was already asleep and she needed to calm her racing thoughts. Behind her, though she didn't know it, the room had transformed. Every single person had stopped moving. The couple who'd been putting on their coats had frozen halfway through, the man's arm still in one sleeve. The teenagers at the refreshment table had abandoned their posts and moved closer to the stage, their phones forgotten in their pockets. The coordinator stood by the wall with her clipboard hanging loose in her hand, tears streaming down her face. Margaret moved from Debussy into Brahms, one of his gentler intermezzos. Her arthritis should have been bothering her by now. She'd been playing for 15 minutes straight, longer than she'd played in half a year. But she felt no pain. Her fingers felt young again, strong and sure. The muscle memory was so deep, it bypassed her conscious mind entirely. Her hands knew these pieces better than they knew anything else. She played Satie next. Gymnopédie. No. One, that strange, haunting piece that always sounded both sad and peaceful at the same time. The notes were simple, almost childlike in their purity, but the emotion behind them was anything but simple. This was the music of loneliness, of quiet contemplation, of sitting alone in an empty house and wondering how to keep going. But as Margaret played, something shifted. The sadness in the music didn't crush her the way she'd feared it would. Instead, it felt like it was lifting something off her shoulders. Like each note was carrying away a small piece of the weight she'd been carrying. She realized she was crying, tears running down her cheeks and dripping onto her hands, but she kept playing. The tears didn't stop the music. If anything, they made it more honest. She transitioned into something different now, something less classical. Her fingers found the opening chords of What a Wonderful World, but not the version everyone knew from the radio. This was her own arrangement, something she'd worked out years ago. It's mixing the familiar melody with classical harmonies and jazz chords that David used to love. He'd hummed this song constantly, especially in the garden. Even when the Alzheimer's had stolen almost everything else, he'd still hummed it while touching his tomato plants or pulling weeds from the flower beds. Margaret played it slowly, stretching out each phrase, adding little flourishes and variations that made it uniquely hers. The melody was so familiar that everyone in the room knew it instantly, but the way she played it was something else entirely. It wasn't just a pretty tune about trees and roses and skies of blue. The way Margaret played it, the song became a meditation on beauty and loss, on how the world could be wonderful even when your heart was broken, on how love didn't disappear just because the person you loved was gone. Her left hand walked up and down the bass notes while her right hand wove the melody through chord, progressions that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. She'd never written this arrangement down. It lived only in her fingers, changing slightly each time she played it, responding to however she felt in that particular moment. Today it sounded different than it ever had before. Today it sounded like goodbye and hello at the same time. It's like an ending and a beginning. The music built and swelled, filling every corner of the recreation center. Margaret's fingers moved faster now, adding runs and trills, taking chances she'd never taken when she was teaching, playing with the freedom of someone who'd stopped caring about making mistakes and started caring only about telling the truth. And the truth was this: she missed David so much it felt like a physical wound, but she was still here. She was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. She brought What a Wonderful World to a gentle close, the final chord ringing out clear and true. Then she sat there for a moment, her hands resting on the keys, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She'd done it. She'd play it again. And the world hadn't ended. David wasn't here to listen, but somehow she felt like he had heard it anyway. Wherever he was, behind her, the room was absolutely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, but something different, something reverent. It was the kind of silence that comes after something profound has happened. When people need a moment to process what they've just experienced, when words feel inadequate and anything you might say would somehow diminish what just occurred. Margaret slowly lifted her hands from the piano and placed them in her lap. She was exhausted suddenly, drained in a way that felt both terrible and good at the same time. She'd poured everything she had into that music. Every feeling she'd been holding back, every tear she'd been too afraid to cry. And now she sat there empty, but somehow lighter, like a vessel that had been filled too. Full and finally allowed to spill over. She took a shaky breath and turned around on the bench, ready to quietly leave the stage and return to her seat. But what she saw when she looked at the crowd made her freeze. Every single person in the room was staring at her, and almost every single person was crying. The elderly man in the third row had his face buried in his hands, his whole body shaking. His wife had her arm around him, tears streaming down her own face. The middle-aged woman Margaret had noticed earlier was clutching a tissue to her mouth, her eyes red and swollen. The teenage volunteers weren't even trying to hide their emotions. One girl had mascara running down her cheeks. A boy who couldn't have been more than 16 stood with his arms wrapped around himself, tears dripping off his chin. Even the coordinator had slid down the wall and was sitting on the floor, her professional composure completely abandoned. Margaret didn't understand what had happened. She'd just played some piano. That was all. A few pieces she'd known for years, played in a room with mediocre acoustics on an old, slightly out-of-tune instrument. But as she looked at all those tear-stained faces, she began to realize that maybe she'd done something more than that. Maybe she'd given these people permission to feel everything they'd been holding back. Maybe her music had opened a door they'd been keeping locked, just like she had. For what felt like forever, nobody moved. Margaret sat on the piano bench, her hands still trembling slightly, looking out at a room full of crying strangers. She felt exposed suddenly, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd just opened up her heart and laid it bare in front of all these people. Now they were staring at her with such raw emotion that she didn't know where to look. Then, slowly one person started clapping. It was the elderly man in the third row, the one who'd been sobbing into his hands. His applause was soft at first, almost hesitant, but steady. His wife joined in, then the woman sitting alone, then the teenagers, then everyone else. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause that wasn't polite or obligatory, but thunderous and genuine. People rose to their feet, some of them still wiping tears from their faces, others clutching their hands to their chests like they were trying to hold something precious inside. The sound of clapping filled the recreation center, bouncing off the walls, growing louder and louder. Margaret sat frozen on the bench, overwhelmed. She'd played hundreds of recitals in her life, received countless rounds of applause from proud parents and students. But this was different. This wasn't appreciation for technical skill or a perfectly executed performance. This was something deeper. Her daughter appeared at the side of the stage, climbing up to reach her mother. She wrapped her arms around Margaret and held her tight, both of them crying now. "Dad would be so proud," her daughter whispered into her hair. "Mom, that was beautiful. That was so, so beautiful." Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her emotions too big for words. She just held on to her daughter and let the applause wash over her. Let herself feel it without pushing it away. The crowd kept clapping, some people shouting words of thanks. Others just standing with tears streaming down their faces, expressing something through that simple act of bringing their hands together that they couldn't say any other way. When the applause finally began to fade, Margaret expected people to return to their seats, to move on with the event. But instead, something unexpected happened. The elderly man from the third row made his way slowly toward the stage. He was using a cane, his steps careful and measured, but his face was determined. He stopped in front of Margaret, and she could see that his eyes were still wet with tears. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough and broken. "My sister. I lost her last year. Alzheimer's. She was only 63. He paused, struggling with the words. "I haven't been able to cry about it until now. I've been holding it in, trying to be strong for my wife, for my kids. But your music?" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It broke something open in me, something that needed to break." Before Margaret could respond, he reached out and squeezed her hand. Then he walked away, and someone else took his place. A woman in her 50s, her face lined with exhaustion. "My mother doesn't know who I am anymore," she said quietly. "I drive 3 hours every weekend to visit her, and she looks at me like I'm a stranger. Sometimes she gets angry, asks me why I'm in her room, and I smile and pretend it doesn't hurt. Tears spilled over her cheeks. But it does hurt. God, it hurts so much. And today, listening to you play, I finally let myself feel it. All of it, one by one, people approached Margaret. Some wanted to share their stories. Others just wanted to say thank you. A man in his 40s told her about his father who'd just been diagnosed, how terrified he was of what was coming. A woman around Margaret's age talked about her husband, gone 3 years now, and how she'd packed away all his things but still couldn't figure out how to keep living without him. The teenage girl with the smeared mascara came up to, surprising Margaret. "My grandmother has Alzheimer's," she said, her voice soft. "I'm only 17, and I don't really understand what's happening to her. But she used to play piano for me when I was little. She'd let me sit on her lap while she played, and I'd try to press the keys with her." The girl wiped at her eyes. "Listening to you today, I remembered that. I remembered how much I loved her, how much I still love her, even though she's different now." Each story landed on Margaret's heart like a stone, heavy but somehow right. She listened to every person, held hands with strangers, shared tears with people whose names she didn't know. The event coordinator eventually brought her a chair so she didn't have to keep standing, and still the line continued. People waited patiently for their turn, not checking their watches or seeming impatient, but standing quietly with the kind of patience that comes from knowing something important is happening. Margaret's daughter stayed close, bringing her water, offering tissues, providing support without hovering. She watched her mother with something like wonder, seeing a version of her she hadn't seen in a long time. Not the broken, grieving woman who'd been hiding in her house for 6 months, but someone stronger. Someone who was still wounded but healing. Someone who'd found a way to turn her pain into something that could help others. A woman approached who looked to be in her early 30s. Well-dressed and professional, clearly not someone who'd been personally touched by Alzheimer's. Margaret wondered why she was crying. Why she'd waited in this long line? The woman smiled shyly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't have a story like everyone else. My family is healthy. But I've been going through something difficult, a divorce, and I've been so angry and closed off. When you played, something shifted in me. The way you put all that emotion into the music. All that love and grief and beauty mixed together, it reminded me that it's okay to feel things deeply. That maybe being broken open isn't the end of the world." Margaret squeezed her hand. "It's not the end," she said softly. "It's scary, but it's not the end."
Hour
passed, maybe more. The line slowly dwindled. Margaret talked with each person who approached, shared quiet moments of understanding, offered the kind of comfort that comes from simply being present with someone in their pain. She was exhausted, but also strangely energized, like she'd tapped into something she'd forgotten existed inside her. A sense of purpose. A reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with just surviving another day. The coordinator finally approached. Her face still blotchy from crying, but wearing a genuine smile. "I don't even know what to say," she admitted. "We were hoping to raise $5,000 today for Alzheimer's research. We've already collected over $15,000, and people are still donating. But more than that, you've given everyone here something we can't put a price on. You've reminded us that we're not alone." She paused, then added, "I lost my dad to this disease 2 years ago. I organize these events because I don't know what else to do with all the anger and sadness. But today, for the first time since he died, I feel like maybe there's a way through it. Not over it or around it, but through it. So thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." After everyone had spoken with her, after the last person had shared their story and the room had mostly cleared out, Margaret sat down at the piano one more time. She was bone-tired, emotionally drained in a way she hadn't been since David's funeral. But she placed her hands on the keys and played one final piece. Something simple this time, gentle and quiet. A lullaby she used to play for her daughter when she was small. The same lullaby she'd hummed to David on his worst nights when the confusion and fear were too much for him. The few people still in the room stopped what they were doing and listened. The coordinator paused in the middle of taking down decorations. The volunteers stopped stacking chairs. Margaret's daughter stood by the refreshment table, one hand over her heart, watching her mother with eyes full of love and pride. The lullaby was only a few minutes long, but Margaret played it like it was the most important piece in the world, because in that moment, it was. It was her way of saying goodbye to the afternoon, to the shared grief of this room full of strangers who weren't strangers anymore, to the version of herself who'd walked in here a few hours ago, convinced she'd never play again. When the final notes faded away, Margaret stood up from the piano bench. Her legs were stiff, her back ached, and her fingers were sore. But she felt more alive than she had in months. She looked at the old upright piano, ran her hand along the dusty lid, and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered to it, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking the instrument or David or music itself. Or maybe all three. Her daughter came over and took her arm. "Ready to go home, Mom?" Margaret nodded. But as they walked toward the door, she turned back one more time to look at the piano sitting on the small stage. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, she'd open the lid on the piano in her living room. Tomorrow, she'd sit down and play again. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she needed to. Because music wasn't something you could lock away, no matter how much it hurt to set it free. Actually, Margaret said to her daughter, "Can we stop somewhere on the way home?" "Sure. Where?" "The music store downtown. I need to buy some new sheet music." She smiled, a real smile, the first one that had reached her eyes in months. "I think it's time I started teaching again." Margaret stood in front of her living room piano that evening, staring at it like she was seeing it for the first time. The dust on the lid was thicker than she'd realized, a visible reminder of the 6 months she'd let it sit untouched. She ran her finger through the dust, leaving a clean line in the dark wood. Her daughter had offered to stay with her, but Margaret had gently insisted she wanted to be alone. This was something she needed to do by herself. She lifted the lid slowly, half expecting the hinges to creak from disuse. The keys looked the same as they always had, waiting patiently like old friends who understood why she'd been away. Margaret sat down on the familiar bench, the same one she'd sat on thousands of times before. The same one she'd shared with young students, helping them find the right keys, correcting their posture, encouraging them when they wanted to give up. Her hands settled onto the keys, and she began to play. Not anything complicated or profound this time, just scales. Simple C major scales, up and down. The kind of exercise she'd made every student practice until they could do it in their sleep. Her fingers stumbled at first, still tired from the afternoon, but she kept going. Up and down, letting her hands remember their purpose. Then she played a few simple songs. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Mary Had a Little Lamb. The kind of beginner pieces she used to teach to 5-year-olds. But even these simple melodies felt meaningful now. They were the building blocks of everything else, the foundation that all the complex pieces rested on. There was something comforting about returning to the basics, stripping away all the complications and just focusing on the pure act of making music. She played for an hour, maybe longer. The light outside faded from evening to full darkness, but she didn't get up to turn on any lamps. She just sat in the growing shadows, her fingers moving across the keys, relearning what they'd always known. It felt like coming home after a long journey, finding something precious you thought was lost forever. When she finally stopped playing, her hands were tired but happy. That was the only way she could describe it, happy. She sat in the darkness for a while, thinking about the afternoon, about all those faces in the recreation center, about the stories people had shared with her. She thought about the elderly man with the cane who hadn't been able to cry for his sister, the exhausted daughter who drove 3 hours every weekend to visit a mother who didn't recognize her, the teenage girl remembering her grandmother's lap and the piano, keys they'd pressed together. Margaret realized something sitting there in the dark. Her grief hadn't gone anywhere. It was still there, still heavy, still real. She still missed David with an ache that sometimes made it hard to breathe. But today she'd discovered that grief didn't have to be the end of the story. It could be transformed into something else. Not erased or forgotten, but channeled into something that could help other people carry their own burdens a little more easily. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than she had in months. She made coffee and actually drank it while it was still hot. She opened the curtains to let sunlight flood the living room. Then she sat down and made a phone call to the senior center across town, the one she'd heard about but never visited. When someone answered, Margaret took a deep breath and introduced herself. "I'm a retired piano teacher," she said, "and I was wondering if you might be interested in having someone volunteer to give music lessons, specifically for people dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia and their caregivers." The woman on the other end of the phone sounded surprised but interested. They talked for 20 minutes about what such a program might look like. The senior center had a piano that rarely got used. They had residents who might benefit from music therapy, family members who came to visit with sadness written all over their faces. By the end of the conversation, Margaret had scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss details. After hanging up, she sat with her coffee and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation, excitement even. Not the kind of excited energy that makes you want to jump around, but a quiet, steady sense that maybe there was still meaningful work left for her to do. That maybe David's death, as devastating as it was, didn't mean her own life had to be over too. Her daughter called that afternoon, checking in like she always did. But this time when she asked how Margaret was doing, Margaret had real things to tell her. About the phone call to the senior center, about practicing at the piano the night before, about the new sheet music she'd picked up at the store. Simple pieces designed for students with memory problems or limited dexterity. "That's wonderful," her daughter said, and Margaret could hear the relief and happiness in her voice. "I'm so proud of you." "I'm scared," Margaret admitted. "Scared that I'll get there and fall apart. Scared that seeing other people go through what we went through with your dad will be too much. It might be too much sometimes," her daughter said gently. "But you don't have to do this alone. And you don't have to do it perfectly. You just have to show up. Show up." Such simple words, but they carried weight. Margaret had been showing up for David every single day for 3 years. Even when it was impossibly hard, even when he didn't know who she was anymore. She'd shown up yesterday at the recreation center, even though every instinct had told her to stay hidden. Maybe showing up was the most important thing anyone could do. The following week, Margaret walked into the senior center for her meeting. The director gave her a tour, showing her the common areas. The piano in the corner of the activities room, the space where she could work with students. They talked about starting small, maybe 1 or 2 students at first, seeing how it went. Margaret suggested also offering group sessions where caregivers could come with their loved ones. Making music together even if the person with dementia couldn't remember the notes or the names of songs. Within a month, Margaret had her first student. A man in his early 70s named Harold, who'd been diagnosed with early stage Alzheimer's and wanted to learn piano before his memory got worse. He came to his lessons with a notebook where he wrote everything down, knowing he might not remember it the next time. Margaret taught him slowly, patiently, celebrating every small victory. When Harold played Ode to Joy all the way through without looking at the music, his eyes filled with tears. "I did it," he said. "I actually did it." "You did," Margaret confirmed, squeezing his shoulder. "And even if you forget how to play it tomorrow, you did it today. That matters." More students followed. Some were residents of the senior center. Others were people from the community who'd heard about the program. Margaret started a weekly group session she called Music and Memory, where caregivers brought their loved ones with dementia. They sang simple songs together, played rhythm instruments, and sometimes just listened to Margaret play piano while they held hands with their family members. One afternoon, the woman from the recreation center, the one who'd driven 3 hours to visit her mother, showed up at the senior center with an elderly lady in a wheelchair. "This is my mom," she said to Margaret. "I don't know if she'll engage at all, but I wanted to try." Margaret sat at the piano and began playing old standards from the 1950s and 60s. For most of the session, the elderly woman stared blankly ahead, unresponsive. But then Margaret played Unforgettable, and something changed. The woman's eyes focused. Her lips began moving, forming the words even though no sound came out. Her daughter gasped, tears streaming down her face. It was the first time in 8 months that her mother had shown any recognition of anything. Moments like that kept Margaret going. Not every session was transformative. Some days were hard. Some days she'd come home exhausted and sad, the weight of all that collective grief pressing down on her. On those days, she'd sit at her piano at home and play for David, telling him about her day, imagining he could hear her somehow. But there were also days filled with unexpected joy. The day Harold's wife came to watch a lesson and started crying because she'd forgotten her husband could smile like that. The day a woman with mid-stage dementia suddenly remembered how to play chopsticks and laughed with pure delight. The day a caregiver told Margaret that these weekly music sessions were the only time she felt like she could breathe, like she wasn't drowning in the weight of responsibility. 6 months after that afternoon at the recreation center, Margaret found herself sitting at the same upright piano on the small stage. The coordinator had asked her to come back for another fundraising event, to play for the crowd again. This time, Margaret didn't hesitate. She arrived early, her fingers warmed up, her heart ready. As she played that afternoon, she looked out at the audience and saw familiar faces. The elderly man with the cane who waved at her from his seat. The teenage volunteer who was now helping Margaret with her programs at the senior center. The woman whose mother didn't recognize her, who mouthed thank you from across the room. But she also saw new faces. People experiencing grief for the first time. People in the middle of their caregiving journeys. People who needed to know they weren't alone. And as Margaret's fingers moved across the keys, she understood fully what David had meant in that moment of clarity 2 years ago. Music wasn't hers to keep. It was hers to give. The performance ended.